Let me guess, you thought no one noticed you sleeping in that alley? The vendor smirked, slamming the cart shut as Marco flinched, clutching his empty wallet tighter. But before the man could spit out another insult, someone stepped from the shadows. A familiar silhouette, broad shoulders, slow, deliberate stride. Sylvester Stallone. No cameras, no crew, just two brothers. And what Stallone did next? It didn't make headlines, but it left the entire city inspired in a way that no blockbuster ever could. Welcome to Stallone Unleashed. Let's uncover what really happened. Rain slicked the narrow alley where Sylvester Stallone lingered, breath misting in the chill before dawn. A lone street lamp cast a sickly glow over overflowing trash bins and soggy cardboard boxes. He didn't usually wander here. This part of town bustled with late-night revelers and desperate souls seeking shelter. But something had drawn him into these shadows this morning. A soft groan echoed against crumbling brick. Stallone paused, eyes narrowing as he moved toward the sound. Behind an upturned crate lay his younger brother, Marco, shoulders hunched against the damp concrete. His coat hung open, soaked through. His face, gaunt and restless, turned toward Stallone, hope and shame warring in his eyes. Sylvester crouched without a word. He studied the trembling hands clutching a nearly empty wallet, the faded receipt for last month's rent slipping from tattered jeans. A flash of anger rose in him. Anger at the system that let good people fall through its cracks, at the secrets his brother bore alone. But he swallowed it down, replaced it with something quieter and stronger. He offered his arm. "Come on," he said softly, voice rough but steady. Marco hesitated, then accepted, staggering to his feet. Stallone steadied him and led him through the alley's exit onto a deserted street. Nose still stinging with rain, Marco pressed closer, leaning on Sylvester's shoulder as they walked. No curses, no dramatic speeches, just the steady rhythm of Stallone's footsteps guiding his brother away from darkness. At the corner, they stopped before a small, shuttered coffee cart. When Stallone knocked on the metal door, the vendor, bleary-eyed, peered out in surprise. Without a word, Stallone extracted a wad of bills larger than Marco's rent. The vendor's eyes flicked to Marco as Stallone nodded once. The door swung open, the engine hissed, and steam curled into the dawn. Marco stared, breath catching. Stallone covered the distance in two strides, placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, and squeezed. No fanfare, no applause, just a silent promise kept. And somewhere behind them, as the coffee cart's engine growled to life, dawn crept through the alley, painting their path in pale gold. The morning sun filtered through half-open blinds as Marco sat at the tiny kitchen table, fingers tracing the rim of a chipped mug. He stared at the chipped paint and the stack of bills he couldn't pay. Rent, utilities, overdue notices crowding the edge of the table like vultures. His lips parted when Stallone slipped into the doorway, fresh coffee steaming in a thermos. Marco's throat tightened. He knew the look on his brother's face, quiet concern mixed with something more. He swallowed hard, voice barely above a whisper. He didn't ask for money. He couldn't. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and produced an envelope, its flap already creased open. "For next month," Stallone said, setting the thermos down. His tone was gentle, almost apologetic, as though he regretted the necessity. He slid the envelope across the table. Marco's eyes flicked from the envelope to his brother's face, searching for a catch, an expectation, anything that would justify the shame curling in his stomach. But Stallone only stood there, arms loose at his sides, waiting. No questions, no scolding, just the steady man who had built his life on sweat and discipline, now offering more quietly than anyone ever had. Marco swallowed a second time, voice wavering. "Thank you," he managed. The words felt ridiculous in the face of what he owed, but they were all he had. Stallone nodded once and lifted the mug in a small, brotherly salute. "Don't mention it." The quiet stretched between them like a fragile thread. Marco wondered how he'd slipped so far, how the rent pile had grown, how pride had blinded him to the help he needed. He reached for the thermos, hands shaking, pouring coffee into the chipped mug. The steam curled between them, a private haze that carried Stallone's unspoken promise. No matter how heavy the burden, he would shoulder it without fanfare. Outside, the city stirred. Horns, footsteps, the distant thump of construction. But inside that small kitchen, time slowed. Marco lifted the coffee to his lips and tasted something more than bitterness. He tasted relief. And in that simple moment, no grand gestures, no cameras, no crowds, he understood what true strength looked like: quiet, steadfast, and always there when you needed it most. Before sunrise, Sylvester Stallone laced up worn training shoes in the corner of his modest garage. A single overhead bulb cast long shadows across the punching bag, swaying gently from last night's workout. Routine was sacred to him, a fortress against chaos. He tapped the bag twice, testing its weight, then launched into a steady rhythm of jabs and crosses, each strike deliberate, each breath measured. The garage smelled of sweat and rubber mats. Photographs of boxing legends and faded film posters lined the walls, a silent gallery of discipline and dreams. Stallone moved through shadowboxing drills, pivoting on calloused feet, arms cutting through the air like polished steel. His muscles flexed and released in practice sequences, years of repetition woven into his bones. Midway through, his phone buzzed on a nearby workbench. He paused, towel draped around his neck, and read a text from Marco. "Thanks again. I went to work today." Stallone's jaw softened. He typed a quick reply. No need for flowery praise, just a thumbs-up emoji, and returned his focus to the bag. After rounds of heavy bag work, he switched to calisthenics. Push-ups in crisp sets, pull-ups that brought his chin level with the bar, sit-ups until burn blurred into resolve. The hum of traffic drifted through the open garage door, but inside Stallone's world was quiet, controlled, private. He paused at the weight bench, loaded 2 plates for a modest press. He lowered the bar to his chest, held it for a breath, then pressed upward, arms trembling slightly under the load. Discipline, he reminded himself silently, was the backbone of every victory, on screen and off. As sweat dripped onto the concrete floor, he wiped his brow and glanced at the clock, just past 6. He packed his duffel, gym clothes, a water bottle, a small envelope tucked into a side pocket, and stepped out into the crisp morning. Neighbors waved from their driveways, a nod here, a quiet thumbs up there. Stallone returned each greeting with a steady smile, but said nothing. By day's first light, he was gone, out the door to scripts, meetings, and movie sets. But in that early hour, he recharged his spirit. Routine wasn't showmanship. It was the quiet forge behind every performance. And as long as he kept to it, he could face any role, any challenge, and ensure his family, his brother, would never have to fight alone. Late afternoon light filtered through the living room blinds as Stallone returned from set, fatigue etched into the lines of his face. He carried a duffel bag over one shoulder and a script under his arm, but his eyes searched the empty rooms. The quiet felt heavy, different from the solitude he cherished during training. Marco wasn't home yet. He should have been back by now. His shift ended hours ago. Stallone set the bag down and called out, voice steady but carrying an edge. No answer. He checked the kitchen, dishes stacked unevenly at the sink, the chipped mug from earlier still resting on the counter, half full. A knot tightened in his chest. He sank onto the couch, toes tapping the threadbare carpet. The worry hovered unspoken, but it coursed through his thoughts. Had Marco lost track of time? Had something gone wrong at work? Stallone replayed their morning conversation. The relief in Marco's voice, the brief smile over coffee. It hadn't sounded like a man on the brink. He flipped through the day's script pages without reading a word, mind elsewhere. Outside, traffic hummed, distant sirens rose and fell. Stallone glanced at the clock, already past 8. A flicker of irritation mixed with concern. He pulled open his phone, thumb hovering over Marco's name. But he hesitated. No need to fret his brother further with questions he didn't yet have answers to. Instead, Stallone stood and paced toward the window. He watched the street below, a mother pushing a stroller, a stray cat darting into shadow, a street lamp blinking on. Ordinary scenes, but his heart pounded as though he expected something to rip the calm apart. He checked his messages again. Nothing. He considered calling Marco's manager, then dismissed it. Marco needed space, not more reminders of his death. Stallone returned to the couch and reached into his duffel, withdrawing the small envelope he kept tucked inside. He pressed it in his palm, feeling the weight of his promise. The worry remained, silent, persistent, but he let it sit beside him, a reminder of why he pushed himself so hard each morning. Discipline, preparation, foresight, these had carried him through every battle. And now his fight was to protect his brother in ways that weren't scripted. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathed deep, and steeled himself for the next move, whatever it might be, without yet knowing what that would be. Before the first light, Stallone's phone vibrated against the nightstand. He sat up, heart thudding, and read Marco's terse message. Locked out. Lost keys. Can't get in. He swung his feet onto the floor and was moving before he fully registered the time. 5:14 a.m. He dressed swiftly in jeans and a leather jacket, eyes still heavy with sleep. Outside, the air was crisp, dew clinging to parked cars. Stallone jogged to his truck, loaded for every tomorrow, jackhammer of routine still leaping in his chest. He texted Marco, "I'm on my way." No need for extra words. When he reached Marco's apartment, the lobby lights were dim, and the door to the maintenance room hung askew. Marco stood on the staircase landing, shoulders slumped, face drawn under low light. Stallone approached without a word, sliding one arm around his brother's shoulder. Marco leaned in, relief softening his features. They climbed to Marco's door together. Stallone produced a locksmith's bump key from his jacket pocket. He carried tools for more battles than scripts, and worked the lock with practiced ease. The door clicked open. Marco kicked off scuffed sneakers and stepped inside. Stallone flicked the light switch. The apartment was empty but for scattered mail, a lamp glowing on the kitchen table beside an envelope marked urgent. Marco picked it up, unfolding the letter within. His jaw shifted as he read. A final notice from the landlord. Rent due in 3 days or face eviction. Stallone's chest tightened at the sight of the official seal and the weight it carried. He closed the distance and placed a firm hand on Marco's back. "No worries," Stallone said, voice low but certain. He reached into his jacket and pulled out another envelope, identical to the first, and slid it onto the table. Marco stared, speechless. Stallone didn't invite thanks. Instead, he nodded toward the open door, as if to say, "Let's get back to sleep." Outside, dawn was brushing the horizon with pale gold. Marco exhaled, tension melting. Stallone guided him toward the couch, patted his shoulder, and stepped back into the hallway. The sun rose fully as Stallone closed the door quietly behind him, leaving Marco with a letter and the priceless gift of time. The afternoon sunlight spilled into Marco's apartment, illuminating stacks of unopened bills on the coffee table. Each envelope seemed to mock him with reminders of late fees, service disconnect notices, and the relentless march of interest. He ran a hand through his hair and sighed, leaning back against the sofa's worn armrest. The weight of his situation pressed down like an anchor, every decision tethered to money he didn't have. His phone buzzed. Stallone's name lit the screen. Marco stared at it, throat tightening. He knew his brother would ask how much rent was left, whether the utilities were straight. The kindness in those questions cut deep. Every answer would sting like fresh salt in an old wound. Finally, he tapped to call. Stallone picked up on the third ring. His voice was calm, as steady as ever. "Everything okay?" he asked. Marco forced a casual tone. "Yeah, just looking over these bills." He waved his hand toward the table. "Feels like I'm drowning." Silence. Then Stallone said softly, "Let's sort it." "Ow!" Marco's voice cracked. "You've already." "I'm not done." Stallone's words were quiet, determined. "You've carried this alone too long." Marco closed his eyes, anger flaring at himself and the world that had led him here. "I don't want charity." "Call it what you like," Stallone replied. "Call it brotherhood." They laid out the numbers together. Rent, utilities, overdue notices. Stallone listened as Marco read amounts, scribbled them on a notepad. When the totals emerged, they were staggering. Stallone promised to handle the rent and utility catch-up. No questions, no conditions. He even offered to cover next month's bills, giving Marco breathing room for the first time in months. Marco stared at the list, cheeks burning. "I don't know how to thank you." Stallone's laughter was soft. "By living," he said, "by getting back on your feet." The burden shifted, lightening on Marco's shoulders. Tears pricked at his eyes, tears he hadn't allowed himself since the eviction notice. He swallowed and nodded. "I'll make this count," he vowed. "You will," Stallone said. "And I'll be here," quietly. When the call ended, Marco looked around the apartment with new eyes. The stacks of bills still lay there, but for the first time, they felt conquerable. He picked up a pen, turned toward the notepad, and began planning a path forward, one step at a time, knowing he no longer carried the burden alone. Before dawn, Stallone slipped from his apartment and into the chill of an empty street. His breath puffed in the air as he jogged toward the community shelter where Marco had volunteered weeks ago. Marco spoke of the place quietly, guilt mixing with gratitude whenever he mentioned working there in exchange for a hot meal. Stallone paused at the locked iron gate. He surveyed the perimeter, peeling paint, broken window panes, graffiti scrawled like desperate slogans. The shelter's reputation had slipped over the years, donations dwindling, staff stretched thin. He placed a gloved hand on the gate and drew in a steady breath. He circled to the rear, where dumpsters overflowed and a service door hung, slightly ajar. With gentle strength, Stallone pushed it open. Inside, he found rows of cots lined with thin blankets and weary faces rising in surprise. He offered no explanation, only a small duffel filled with newly laundered sheets, blankets, and donated toiletries, items he'd quietly secured through contacts. Volunteers glanced up, bewildered by the early arrival. Stallone moved among them, stacking supplies by each cot. His presence spoke without words. Someone cared enough to prepare for their comfort before sunrise. He straightened crooked blankets, folded towels with precise care, and left a stack of hot coffee mugs by the back counter. No one approached him. He didn't linger for praise. In the corner, a volunteer recognized him. Barely, eyes widening as Stallone offered a nod and a small smile. The volunteer turned to wake the next shift, voice rising in hushed excitement. "Hey, we've got help back here." Stallone slipped out the way he came, the door clicking softly behind him. Outside, the sky blushed with first light. He retraced his steps home, footsteps echoing against empty sidewalks. His mind was calm, purpose fulfilled without billboard announcements or fanfare. He had done what needed doing. Later, when Marco arrived for his shift, he found the shelter transformed. Blankets were fresh, coffee ready, supplies neatly arranged. Volunteers buzzed with grateful chatter, unaware of who orchestrated the change. Marco wandered through the rows, eyes misting as he whispered thanks to the empty air. He understood then the depth of Stallone's resolve. Actions rooted not in show, but in unwavering commitment. Silent, steadfast, and entirely for his brother and those in need. And in that quiet dawn, Marco realized gratitude could live in deeds, not words. Marco returned from work to find a plain brown paper bag on his doorstep. He paused, curiosity tempered by caution, before kneeling to pick it up. Inside, nestled between crumpled tissue, were fresh oranges, a loaf of hearty bread, a wedge of cheese, and a small handwritten note. "I thought you might be hungry." He glanced around. No lights in Stallone's place across the courtyard. The note bore only his brother's initials. Marco carried the bag inside and set the groceries on the kitchen table. His stomach nodded at the simple kindness. He ran a finger over the note, tasting the weight of unspoken care. That evening, as he heated the bread and sliced the cheese, he replayed the moment in his mind. Stallone must have known Marco was scraping by breakfast and lunch at work. The gesture was small, but in its quiet way, it spoke volumes. You're not alone. The next morning, Marco took an orange from the bag and bit into its sweet flesh, juices dripping down his chin. He felt a surge of warmth, imagining Stallone slipping across the courtyard at dawn, seeking out the freshest produce. Guilt nibbled at him. He hadn't asked for this. But more than guilt, he felt relief and something like pride in having a brother who noticed the smallest struggle and met it head-on. That afternoon, he loaded the empty bag into the trash and found another note tucked inside his mailbox. "Dinner on me tonight." No more details, just Stallone's initials. Marco's pulse quickened. He'd already eaten leftovers, but he smiled, touched by the thought. He couldn't leave it at that. He returned Stallone's kindness with a simple act of his own. A crisp sheet of notebook paper with a sketch of 2 oranges side by side. And underneath, "Thank you." He slipped it under Stallone's door, pressing his fingertip to the paper so his brother would know he'd held it. Later, Stallone found the sketch on his doorstep. He studied it for a moment, lips curving into a rare, quiet smile. No fanfare, no cameras, just a brother's gesture reflected back, each line an echo of care. In that small exchange, both men discovered that kindness didn't always need words or headlines. Often, it needed only a first gesture. He pulled on a hoodie and slipped into a pair of work gloves before heading to the old community center on the edge of town. No one recognized the scruffy man arriving before dawn, carrying paint cans and rollers. Stallone blended into the shadows as he pushed open the heavy doors. Inside, peeling walls and scuffed floors whispered of better days. He set to work without hesitation, stirring bright teal paint until it matched the swatch tape to the far wall. The center's director, already there bleary-eyed, paused in surprise. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice laced with sleep and hope. Stallone offered a small nod and a thumbs up. No name, no questions. For hours, he painted, filling the room with fresh color. Each smooth stroke over the cracked plaster felt like erasing years of neglect. He moved methodically, pausing only to wipe sweat from his brow and refill his tray. Volunteers trickled in. A high school student with paint-spattered pants, a retired teacher clutching a stack of posters, and a young mom whose children clung to her legs. They greeted Stallone warmly, unaware of his other life. He returned their smiles with quiet nods and focused on the walls. At midday, the director brought out sandwiches and coffee. Stallone accepted a sandwich, wolfed it down in a single breath, then returned to the wall. Someone snapped a photo. No flash, just a phone camera. Stallone didn't flinch. He made peace with being seen in sweat-stained clothes. By late afternoon, the mural wall was complete, vivid and welcoming, a cascade of leaves and sunlight that seemed to breathe life into the room. The volunteers stepped back, hands on hips, admiring their handiwork. Stallone joined them, nodding toward the mural, and for the first time, the director recognized him. "Mr. Stallone?" she whispered, cracking her voice. He shrugged, rubbing paint from his hands. "Just wanted to help." Word spread fast. Social media lit up with pictures of Stallone painting side by side with neighbors. But Stallone didn't stick around for accolades. He packed up his rollers, waved once to the group, and slipped out the back door before anyone could ask for autographs. Later, as he drove home, he watched the sunrise reflect off the freshly painted walls through the center's front windows. Undercover kindness, he thought, was the purest kind. No headlines, no cameras, just doing what needed doing. His phone buzzed just after midnight. "Left something at your door." Check. Stallone didn't sleep much these days, so he slipped on a jacket and headed out. The neighborhood was quiet, streetlights casting long pools of yellow over empty sidewalks. At Marco's door, he found a large insulated bag. He unzipped it and inhaled the scent of pasta, penne tossed in a rich tomato sauce, meatballs nestled against fresh basil. Next to it sat a small container of garlic bread and a note, "Dinner at midnight." No fuss. Stallone knocked once and waited. When Marco cracked the door, exhaustion and surprise flickered across his face. "You didn't have to." Stallone lifted a finger to his lips, then passed the bag inside. "Thought you could use a hot meal." In the dim hallway, Marco closed the door and led Stallone into the kitchen. The living room light was off. The only glow came from the fridge light as Marco arranged plates on the table. Stallone watched him move, slower than usual, haunted by bills and missed meals. They sat at the tiny table, fork and spoon in hand, breaking the late-night silence with the soft scrape of utensils. Each bite seemed to carry more than flavor. The relief of warmth, the unspoken understanding that he wasn't forgotten. After a few minutes, Marco set his fork down and looked at Stallone. "You're always doing this." "Why?" Stallone shrugged, eyes on his plate. "Because." Marco sighed, shaking his head. "I don't deserve it. You deserve a break." Stallone's voice was firm. "Everyone needs one." They finished the meal in companionable quiet. Stallone stood and gathered the empty dishes, stacking them at the sink. Marco rinsed them as Stallone dried, each movement practiced, calming. When the last plate was cleaned, Marco pushed away from the table. "Thanks," he whispered. Stallone offered a small smile. "Get some rest." He headed back into the night, the insulated bag now empty, his mission complete. The street was still, everything under the same silent watch. Stallone walked away without a glance back, leaving Marco to the warmth and quiet dignity of a midnight delivery that said more than words ever could. Late afternoon light slanted through the apartment window, casting long shadows across the floor. Marco lingered by the door, waiting for Stallone to return from another early morning shoot. He had prepared something small, quiet, that he hoped conveyed his thanks. When Stallone stepped in, tired but steady, Marco slipped into the hallway and returned carrying a narrow wooden box. He handed it to his brother without a word. Stallone looked puzzled, but accepted it. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay a simple brass keychain engraved with the outline of two brothers standing side by side. Stallone's eyes flicked up to Marco. No grand speech had followed their last meal. They both knew words felt hollow next to actions. Stallone lifted the box's lid and ran a fingertip over the engraving. Marco stepped forward, voice low. "Thank you," he said, voice thick with emotion, "for everything you've done for me." Stallone closed the box and held the keychain aloft. He turned it so the engraving caught the light. Two small figures, equal in size, symbolic, not of fame or strength, but of unity. He clipped it to his belt loop. Silence settled between them, but it felt full, like the pause between heartbeats. Stallone nodded, lips curving slightly. Then, in a gesture that was everything and nothing, he slipped his arm around Marco's shoulder and squeezed. In the shifting shadows, gratitude found its shape. Marco rested his head against Stallone's shoulder, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Outside, the city roared on, horns, sirens, the hum of neon, but inside that apartment, time slowed to the space between brothers. No lights, no audience, just two men bound by blood and unspoken promises. Later, Stallone found the keychain's twin sitting on his dresser, another box waiting under the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Marco's reciprocal gift, a photo of the two of them as boys, arms draped around each other's shoulders, forever framed behind glass. They looked at each other across the room, understanding passing in their eyes. Respect and gratitude thrived in quiet moments, in shadows as much as in the light. And in those shadows, they found each other again. Streamers of afternoon light danced across the gymnasium where Marco sat on the bleachers, head bowed beneath the weight of another rejection letter. He stared at the crumpled envelope in his hand, heart sinking. Coaches had passed on him. Clubs couldn't afford another player. Pride and necessity had pushed him to audition for part-time coaching gigs, but doors kept closing. Without a word, Stallone slipped into the back entrance, duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He glanced up, spotted Marco, and silently took a seat a few rows above him. Marco didn't look up. He continued to stare at the envelope, shoulders trembling. Stallone reached into his bag and produced 2 protein bars. He tore the wrapper off one and tossed it down. Marco caught it, confusion flickering in his eyes. He unwrapped and ate it slowly, as if tasting something that shouldn't be there. The silence stretched, heavy with unsaid words. Stallone pulled out a water bottle, popped the cap, and passed it down. Marco took a swig, nodding in gratitude. No commentary, no pep talk, just sustenance. Stallone then opened his bag again, revealing a stack of fresh workout shirts, breathable fabric, Stallone's logo discreetly emblazoned. He tossed them down, one by one, until Marco's lap was covered. Beneath the sweat stains and tears, Stallone had quietly arranged a new start. Gear for training the kids, for coaching next week's sessions, for the chance to prove himself without worrying about attire. Marco's eyes widened. He pressed his palm to his chest, throat tight. He looked up at Stallone, mouth opening for a thank you that never came. Stallone only smiled and gave a small wave, as if to say, "Go on. Use them." Marco rose, gathering the shirts and tossing the empty wrappers and bottles into the trash bin. Stallone stayed seated, watching. Marco turned back, hesitated, then leaned forward and hugged his brother around the waist. Stallone held him steady, arms firm. No speeches, no fanfare, just wordless support. In that quiet arena, Marco realized help could come in small, tangible pieces: food when you're starving, water when you're parched, tools when you're ready to build. And sometimes, the greatest kindness spoke loudest when left unsaid. A mid-morning knock sounded at Marco's apartment door. He opened it to find a plain, white envelope taped neatly in the center. No return address. He frowned and brought it inside, sliding the envelope onto the coffee table. He hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside lay a simple index card with neat handwriting. Rent, $1,200. Due in 2 days. Beneath it, another note. Consider it taken care of. S. Marco's heart pounded as he reread the words. He traced the familiar S. His brother's silent signature. Relief fought with lingering guilt. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the couch, fingers brushing over the card's edge. He pictured Stallone waking before dawn, slipping out of his own home to ensure his brother need not worry about this mounting debt. The thought stung with gratitude and embarrassment both. Marco stood and moved to the small kitchen nook, staring out at the city skyline, sunlight glinting off distant windows. He thought of every sleepless night wrestling with numbers, the calls from the landlord growing more urgent, the fear of eviction lurking like a storm cloud. And now, that cloud had lifted, quietly, without fanfare, erased with a few strokes of ink and a brother's resolve. Marco sank to the floor, the index card clenched in his hand. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to breathe deep, slow breaths, tasting freedom in each inhale. He knew Stallone wouldn't want thanks, wouldn't allow platitudes or tear-jerking speeches. Instead, he'd find some way to insist Marco move forward, rebuild, reclaim stability. He pressed the note to his chest, standing slowly. He walked to the window and looked out at the morning traffic below, imagining Stallone's path home, unaware of the peace he'd delivered. Marco whispered into the glass, "Thank you," not expecting an echo. Later, when Stallone returned, Marco had prepared breakfast, Stallone's favorite omelet, perfectly folded, served with toast. No mention of a note. They sat together in companionable silence, sharing the meal. Stallone eyed the card on the table, but said nothing. Instead, he nodded at Marco's plate. Marco smiled back, words unnecessary. In that quiet kitchen, a brother's burden had vanished, replaced by a silent pact. Rent paid, dignity intact, and a renewed chance to stand on his own 2 feet. When Marco checked his bank app that morning, his stomach tightened. The rent reminder had cleared, but his balance still hovered just above zero, barely enough for food. He closed the app and set his phone down, tension knotting his shoulders. Later, during a lunch break at the shelter, he ducked into an office to sort paperwork. On her desk, the director had left a small envelope addressed to him. He hesitated before opening it. Inside lay a note. For emergencies. Use if you need to eat. Beneath there was a slim debit card embossed with his name and a new, unfamiliar account number. Marco's pulse raced. He flipped the card over. No bank logo, just the initials SC. He walked into the hallway, sliding the door, closed softly, and stared at the card. Stallone's signature whisper echoed in his mind. Silent support again. He slipped the card into his pocket and returned to the shelter, hands shaking as he served coffee to early volunteers. The card felt like a lifeline, an unseen reservoir of trust, and terror rose in him. What if he used it and Stallone discovered the balance dwindling? What if he never replenished it? That evening, Marco faced the card on his kitchen table. He stared at it, as though it held the power to change everything. Finally, his hunger won. He slid the card into his wallet and ordered enough groceries for the week, knowing he could pay for fresh produce and the basics without worry. As the delivery confirmation pinged on his phone, relief warmed his chest. Over the next days, Marco watched the account's balance as groceries, train fare, and shelter supplies withdrew automatically. He never saw a deposit. He only saw Stallone's shadow in every purchase. Each transaction was a reminder that he wasn't alone. One morning, Marco left the apartment early and caught Stallone in the courtyard. The sunrise painted Stallone's face in gold. Marco approached softly, pulling the card from his wallet. Stallone's brow rose in quiet question as Marco held it out. "No more," Marco breathed. "I've got this." Stallone accepted the card, slipping it into his pocket without hesitation. His nod said it all. The account remained open, but the brother it served stood ready to close it himself. In that exchange, both knew the hidden account was more than money. It was a pact of faith made visible. The afternoon air crackled with tension as Stallone and Marco unloaded boxes of donated books at the neighborhood library. A small crowd had gathered, kids in backpacks, elderly patrons leaning on canes, volunteers buzzing with energy. Stallone directed the sorting, Marco scanning titles and stacking them on shelves. Suddenly, a woman in a business suit appeared at the library entrance, phone pressed to her ear. She paused as she watched Marco carefully place a faded copy of a children's classic on the lowest shelf, knees brushing the scuffed wood. Her gaze shifted to Stallone, organizing history texts nearby. Recognizing Stallone, she lowered her phone and hesitated for a heartbeat. Then she approached, eyes soft. "Mr. Stallone," she said quietly. "I didn't expect to see you here." Stallone glanced over and offered a small nod. "Just helping," he replied, voice steady. The woman's attention turned to Marco. "And your brother," she said, voice gentle. "He's doing the shelving?" Marco straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. He managed a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am. He asked me to help today." The woman's eyes lingered on Marco's worn sneakers and the library badge pinned to his shirt. Recognition sparked. "I'm a director of city reads," she explained. We don't often see volunteers with so much dedication, especially someone your age." Marco's cheeks colored. He looked to Stallone, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The woman nodded toward the book stacks. "It's impressive, your commitment. I've been looking for someone to lead our weekend literacy program." Marco's heart pounded. He glanced at his brother, who simply lifted a box with one powerful arm, then looked back at Marco, expression unreadable but supportive. I'd like that," Marco said, voice catching. "Thank you." The director smiled warmly and handed him a program flyer. "Let's talk details next week." As she walked away, Stallone rapped lightly on Marco's shoulder. "See," he murmured. "You've got this." Marco exhaled, astonished. He realized his brother's quiet generosity had given him not just financial freedom, but the chance to rebuild his confidence. And now, an unexpected witness had opened a door he never knew existed. They returned to shelving books, but something between them had shifted, a shared pride in the silent strength that had led Marco here, and the knowledge that sometimes unseen acts of kindness can become the greatest witnesses of all. Neighbors paused on porches and in driveways, trading glances as Stallone's truck rumbled past on its daily supply run. Word had spread quietly. Stallone was helping his brother. The rumors took shape in whispers as people pointed toward Marco's apartment building or the community center where Stallone painted murals before dawn. At the corner grocery, the cashier raised an eyebrow when Marco walked in with cash instead of the usual card. "Everything okay?" she asked softly. Marco nodded, avoiding the hopeful question that swirled around his own mind. Outside the laundromat, two elderly women leaned on their carts. One tapped her chin. "I heard Mr. Stallone paid someone's rent," she murmured. The other clucked her tongue in approval. "Good man." Kids on skateboards slowed as they passed Marco's building, whispering to each other about the action hero who'd been spotted delivering groceries and then vanishing into the night. Some laughed, imagining Stallone crouched behind hedges with an armful of oranges. Others nodded, awed at the simple power of such a legend acting without cameras. In the alley behind the shelter, volunteers exchanged stories over coffee. The sheets refreshed, the food baskets delivered, the hidden account card that kept the kitchen stocked. They spoke of Stallone's humility, how he worked alongside them instead of parading on the front page. Marco felt the shift more keenly than anyone. Each nod from a neighbor, each whispered compliment, felt as if it radiated from him. He worried they might see him as the recipient rather than the man striving to stand or fall on his own. But then Mrs. Alvarez from across the hall stopped him one evening as he collected his mail. "You're doing fine, dear," she said, patting his arm. "We're all glad you've got someone who cares." Her words settled in him like spring rain. The murmurs in the neighborhood weren't about fame or spectacle. They were about respect earned through quiet generosity. Stallone's deeds had sparked something hopeful, a gentle wave of community goodwill that swept through the streets. And in those murmurs, Marco found his own courage growing. He resolved to match the kindness around him, not with grand gestures, but with everyday acts, paying it forward in small ways until the whispers became stories of many, not just one. Steam curled from the mugs as Marco and Stallone sat in their favorite corner of a local coffee shop. The barista, who knew their orders by heart, placed a double espresso in front of Stallone and a latte for Marco. The shop was warm and bright, a sharp contrast to the early mornings they'd spent in shadowed alleys. Marco stirred his latte, watching the cream swirl into a steady caramel spiral. He hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I didn't tell you last week. I ran into Mrs. Henderson." Stallone raised an eyebrow. "The landlord?" Marco nodded. "She pulled me aside, asked how I managed rent on time. She said she's seen the rent check hit her account every month without fail. She said she's never had a tenant she could count on like that." He looked across the table at Stallone, bracing himself. Stallone sipped his espresso, eyes steady. And I didn't correct her," Marco admitted. "I just nodded and said I had help." He paused, voice catching, but felt wrong. "I'm supposed to be the tenant she trusts, not your shadow." Stallone set his mug down. "You're not a shadow. You're the one living here, working, showing up." His tone was firm, but soft around the edges. Marco's gaze dropped to his latte. He knew his brother was right, but guilt gnawed at him. He swirled the mug, creating a tiny whirlpool. "I want her to see me for me." A gentle chuckle surprised him. Stallone leaned forward. "Then let her." He waved toward the counter. "Next month, pay your own rent. I'll still cover utilities." Marco looked up, shock and gratitude mingling on his face. "Really?" Stallone nodded. "You've earned it. Show up. Do the work. Be the tenant she trusts. She'll see you, not me." The barista brought a plate of biscotti as a courtesy. Stallone broke one in half and offered it to Marco like a peace offering. Marco accepted it, feeling a lightness he hadn't known in months. They sat in companionable silence, sipping coffee and nibbling biscotti, the shop's chatter and espresso machine hiss blending around them. For the first time, Marco felt ready to step from his brother's quiet shadow into his own light and savor both the coffee and the revelation that he, too, could stand on his own. Before sunrise, Stallone slipped out of his apartment without waking Marco. He eased into his truck and drove past silent streets until he reached the rundown youth center on Elm Street. The building's windows were boarded, the brick facade cracked, an abandoned shell where children once learned, laughed, and grew. Stallone climbed from the truck carrying a duffel bag filled with tools, paint, and supplies. He pried open a side window, sliding inside like a ghost. In the dim light, he set to work, clearing debris, tightening loose floorboards, and oiling squeaky hinges. He patched holes in the walls with plaster, smoothing rough edges until they were almost unnoticeable. At a makeshift workbench, he assembled shelves and tables from repurposed wood he'd collected days before. His movements were precise, measure twice, cut once. Every nail driven firmly, every joint reinforced. He paused only to sip water or wipe sweat from his brow, muscles flexing beneath a leather jacket that had seen better days. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the broken windows, Stallone mixed bright paint and began rolling color onto the walls, uplifting hues of yellow and sky blue. He stenciled a mural of children reaching for stars, each figure outlined in fine detail. As he worked, he thought of Marco's newfound confidence and how this place could give other young people a chance to stand tall. By mid-morning, the youth center had transformed. Sturdy shelves holding books, a circle of small chairs facing a chalkboard, tables arranged for art projects. The mural glowed behind them, a promise of possibility. Stallone gathered his tools, packed the duffel, and paused at the threshold, surveying the space he'd resurrected in secret. He placed a handwritten note on the chalkboard. "Welcome back. S." Then he slipped out, closing the door quietly behind him. Later that afternoon, volunteers arrived, blinking at the renewal. They exchanged astonished looks as one unlocked the door, revealing the revived center. Whispers turned to laughter, then to activity as they tore open windows and swept floors. News spread of the anonymous benefactor, Stallone's private mission fulfilled without fanfare. And though no cameras captured his work, in the hearts of a community stirring back to life, his presence shone brighter than any spotlight. A crisp breeze carried fallen leaves down the sidewalk as Stallone slipped into the convenience store for his usual late-night snack. He moved to the refrigerated section, scanning rows of drinks, when a voice called out behind him. "Mr. Stallone?" He turned to find a young man, early 20s, wind-tousled hair, eyes bright with gratitude. The man held a crumpled flyer from the reopened youth center, its corners worn from pocket storage. "You fixed it," the young man said, voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't believe it when I came by yesterday. I saw the shelves, the mural. I wondered who'd done it." He cleared his throat. "That place kept me off the streets when I was a kid. I'm heading back to school now because of it." Stallone nodded, unassuming. "Glad to help." The young man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I know it was you. My sister works at the shelter. She saw you painting early mornings. And the library, too. And I heard about the rent." His gaze lingered on Stallone's face. "You save people without asking for anything. I just wanted to say thank you." Stallone offered a small smile, surprised by the outpouring. He reached for a bottle of water and handed it to the young man. "Stay focused," he said. "Keep going." The man swallowed, clutching the water like a lifeline. "I will. And I'll pay it forward, promise." Stallone nodded again, then picked up a bag of trail mix for himself. The young man watched him bag it at the counter, then pressed a 20 across to cover both their snacks. Stallone hesitated. The clerk looked between them, uncertain. "Let me," the young man insisted. "It's on me now." Stallone's steady gaze held his. Finally, he placed the trail mix and water on the counter instead of the 20. "Just make sure you keep your promise." The young man bowed his head. "I will." They left the store together, stepping into the night. Stallone headed one way, the young man the other, but for a moment their paths overlapped. In the glow of the streetlight, Stallone saw hope rekindled in the stranger's eyes. A simple act of gratitude returned as a pledge to spread kindness forward. And in that quiet exchange, both men understood the power of thanks given and received in the dark. The hum of washing machines and clatter of dryers filled the laundromat as Marco shuffled entree 2 rows of gleaming fronts, arms loaded with baskets of clothes. He'd promised himself he'd cover this chore himself, but the coins in his pocket felt thin for the load he needed. Stallone appeared at his side without warning, carrying his own basket. Marco looked up, surprise and a hint of protest in his eyes. Stallone offered a small nod and set his basket down at the adjacent machine. Marco hesitated, then filled his machine's coin slot. The drum began to swirl. He turned back to Stallone's machine and saw Stallone sliding in a handful of quarters. Marco's breath caught. He'd intended to manage this task himself. Stallone caught his gaze. "I got it," he said quietly. "Consider my turn." Marco swallowed and nodded, lifting his own basket. As they transferred clothes into dryers, Stallone folded his laundry with practiced efficiency, every fold crisp and precise. He didn't ask questions. He simply moved with calm purpose. By the time the dryers finished, the little room smelled of fresh cotton. Marco collected his clothes and Stallone's, draping them neatly over an empty table. A mother with a toddler at her hip watched them curiously. The child pointed at Stallone's strong hands and asked in a small voice, "Are you the movie man?" Stallone glanced down and smiled gently at the child. "Just a guy doing laundry today," he replied. The mother chuckled and turned away, leaving Marco to fold his shirts. When both baskets were neat stacks, Stallone tapped Marco's shoulder. "Ready." Marco slung his basket over one arm, meeting Stallone's steady eyes. "Thanks," he said softly. "For everything." Stallone nodded, setting his own basket aside. He tossed a clean towel over Marco's arm. "Anytime." They stepped out into the warm afternoon sun, laundry in hand. For a moment, they paused at the door, two brothers walking side by side, ordinary tasks made extraordinary by shared support. And in that simple chore, Marco realized that sometimes the quietest acts, paying for a load of laundry, folding a towel, carry the loudest meaning of all. Early morning light crept through the kitchen window as Marco brewed coffee. He reached for the sugar jar and found it empty. Frowning, he checked the pantry. No sugar, no fresh milk. He sighed, bracing for another trip to the store. Before he could grab his keys, Stallone appeared in the doorway, holding a paper bag. "Morning," he said, placing it on the counter. Inside were staples: sugar, milk, eggs, and a fresh loaf of bread. No note, just the quiet assurance that Marco's day would start without hiccups. Later, at the shelter, Marco noticed new blankets folded neatly on every cot and a stack of warm jackets by the entrance. Volunteers buzzed about an anonymous donation overnight. Marco felt a swell of pride. This was Stallone's doing too, though no one knew it. At lunchtime, Marco helped distribute meals in the library's reading room. He watched as a child's eyes lit up at a new stack of picture books, the air filled with wonder. The librarian whispered thanks and pointed to a plaque above the shelves, donated by a friend of the community. Marco smiled, knowing behind that inscription stood Stallone's silent hand. That evening, Marco returned home to find his bike tires inflated and the chain oiled, ready to ride. He'd mentioned weeks ago that the clunking chain made rides rough, but he never expected his brother would sneak that maintenance in. He looked up to find Stallone at the door, arms crossed and a grin tugging at his mouth. Marco shook his head. "You've done enough." Stallone shrugged. "Just wanted to help." Marco closed the gap and clapped his brother on the shoulder. "You make invisible help visible," he said. "I see it now." Stallone's expression softened. "Good." In the days that followed, these unseen acts continued. A gas card left in Marco's glove box, a full tank waiting, fresh light bulbs replacing burned-out fixtures in the apartment hallway, a repairman's card tucked under the welcome mat, with a note that reads, "On me." Each gesture was small, discreet, unnoticed by most. Yet together, they wove a net of support that caught Marco every time he stumbled. In the quiet multiplication of kindness, he realized that true generosity wasn't measured in grand events, but in the countless unseen acts that made ordinary life just a little bit easier. Whispers followed Stallone down the sidewalks now. He'd been spotted stacking firewood for an elderly neighbor, slipping envelopes into teachers' mailboxes, and quietly funding after-school programs. At the cafe, the barista confided to Marco that the tip jar had mysteriously doubled one morning, and no one knew who'd left the extra cash. On street corners, conversations circled the same theme. "Have you heard about the guy who keeps giving? It's not charity. They say he just enjoys helping." Each retelling grew more colorful, but none exaggerated the heart of the story. Generosity carried out without announcement or fanfare. Marco noticed how people's eyes softened when Stallone's name came up. Pride, gratitude, a touch of awe. The local newspaper ran a brief item: "Mystery benefactor transforms community," with a photo of Stallone painting the youth center. No mention of interviews, just the facts and growing admiration. One evening, at a block-wide potluck, an organizer raised a toast to the man whose kindness flows like an underground river. No fanfare, only nourishment for our town. Glasses clinked, and Marco felt the warmth of every heartfelt "thank you" echo in his chest. Yet Stallone remained unchanged. He arrived at the event, late, unannounced, wearing a simple jacket, a baseball cap low over his brow. He helped clear dishes without a single pause for recognition, slipped away before dessert, and left behind a cooler stocked with fresh produce for next week's cooking class. Marco watched the scene unfold, a quiet pride swelling inside him. The rumors had taken on a life of their own, but at their core was the bond between two brothers, one honoring the other through acts of care that rippled outward. As the potluck wound down and neighbors drifted home beneath the street lamps, Marco found Stallone leaning against his truck, sipping water. "They're talking about you again," Marco said, voice soft. Stallone shrugged, eyes on the empty street. "Let them." Marco smiled, clinking his water bottle against Stallone's. "To underground rivers. May they never dry up," Stallone replied. And in that moment, they stood together, silent witnesses to the rumors they had sown, rooted in quiet generosity and destined to blossom wherever kindness took hold. A crisp breeze carried the scent of pine as Marco stepped onto the porch of Stallone's childhood home. It had been years since they'd set foot here together, back when scraped knees and sibling fights echoed through these rooms. Now, the house stood quiet, the front door unlocked at Stallone's invitation. Inside, familiar photographs lined the mantel. Two boys in matching Little League uniforms, summer vacations by the lake, holidays crowded with cousins. Marco's heart tightened. He turned to Stallone, who offered a steady nod. They wandered through each room in silence, memories surfacing like ghosts. In the living room, Marco traced the grooves on the coffee table where he and Stallone had carved initials as kids. In the kitchen, he inhaled the lingering aroma of Mom's chocolate chip cookies. "Baked here just last week by Stallone," he'd whispered. Upstairs, they paused before the door of the attic bedroom they once shared. Stallone pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the sunlight. Old trunks lined the walls, bundled blankets, and faded toys waiting inside. Marco stepped forward and lifted the lid of one trunk. He found a crumpled drawing, two stick figures holding hands beneath a bright sun, and a single word scrawled above: family. Stallone watched as Marco's hand trembled. "I kept it," Stallone said softly. "All these years." Tears blurred Marco's vision. "Why?" "Because some things matter," Stallone replied. "No matter how far you fall, you come home." Marco set the drawing beside him and embraced his brother with all the words he'd never said. Stallone held him firm, the strength of their bond sealing the moment. They stood together in that attic, the place where they'd argued over toys and later confided in secrets. Now, they reunited here, with burdens lifted, trust restored, and the silent promise that they would never face life alone again. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines. Inside, two brothers, once pulled apart by hardship, stood side by side, home at last in each other's presence. Sunlight streamed through the community center's new windows, illuminating laughter spilling from every room. Children chased each other across the freshly painted gym floor, their footsteps echoing like music. Adults gathered around tables stacked with baked goods from last night's bake sale, a fundraiser Marco had organized. Stallone arrived quietly, slipping through the double doors with a duffel slung over one shoulder. He paused, surveying the scene. Grandparents sipping lemonade on the patio, teens leading an art workshop, volunteers chatting as they restocked the coffee bar. Pride softened Stallone's usual reserve. Marco spotted him and waved. As they approached, the director stepped forward, hands clasped. "You two have given us more than a building," she said, voice warm. "You've given us hope." Stallone nodded, but it was Marco who replied, "We just wanted a place where everyone belongs." Across the hall, a group of neighbors unveiled a mural on a new wing, painted overnight by local artists who'd volunteered. It depicted hands lifting each other skyward, woven with vibrant colors. Stallone and Marco stood before it, recognizing themes of brotherhood and community woven into every brushstroke. Children tugged at Stallone's sleeve, asking him to help hang decorations for tomorrow's charity game. He knelt down, tying a string of pennants with patient care. Marco joined him, their movements synchronized without instruction, two brothers still sharing unspoken understanding. As the afternoon sun dipped, people gathered outside for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. The mayor praised their dedication, the crowd applauded, and photographers snapped images. Stallone and Marco stood side by side, shadows stretching behind them, smiling quietly. When the ceremony ended, Stallone slipped away to refill water coolers, and Marco handed out flyers for the next event, a financial literacy workshop he'd arranged for struggling families. Neighbors called out their thanks, telling stories of how the center had changed their lives. A single mother who found reliable childcare, a veteran who discovered purpose teaching woodworking, a teenager who rediscovered her love of reading. As dusk settled, lanterns flickered on around the center. Stallone and Marco walked the perimeter, sharing a final look of contentment. The building hummed with life, a testament to countless acts of kindness, big and small. In that glowing twilight, they understood that a community uplifted wasn't built by one hero or one brotherly gesture alone, but by many hands joined together, passing forward the quiet generosity that at first sparked it all. Sunlight filtered through the curtains as Marco stirred awake to the scent of coffee drifting down the hallway. He slipped from bed and found Stallone in the kitchen, pouring 2 mugs with steady hands. A loaf of fresh bread waited on the counter beside a small dish of preserves. Marco leaned against the doorframe, watching his brother move with quiet precision. No film crews, no flashing cameras, just a man at home, preparing breakfast for family. He felt a swell of gratitude, and something more, genuine respect. They sat at the small kitchen table, mugs warming their hands. Stallone tore the bread into chunks, offering half to Marco before sweetening his own. Marco savored the first bite, the taste of a simple life made possible through steadfast support and relentless discipline. "Looks like you've earned some rest," Stallone said, voice gentle. Marco set down his mug, meeting Stallone's gaze. "I've earned respect," he replied, voice steady, "for what you've done and for who you helped me become." Stallone nodded, eyes soft. "You earned it by standing up for yourself." Outside, the neighborhood stirred to life. Shutters opening, dogs trotting down sidewalks, the distant bark of a child's laughter. Inside, 2 brothers shared a moment that felt like both an ending and a beginning. Marco reached across the table, placing his hand over Stallone's. "Thank you," he said simply. No fanfare, no headlines, just the hard-won words of a man who had learned the value of quiet deeds. Stallone squeezed back. "Family," he replied. "Always." They rose together, leaving the breakfast dishes for later. In the living room, photographs from the community center's grand opening lined the mantel. Smiling faces, vibrant murals, children clutching books. Each image whispered of lives changed by unseen hands and unspoken promises. Stepping onto the porch, they breathed in the fresh morning air. Marco rested his arm on Stallone's shoulder as they surveyed the street. The place they had uplifted through countless acts of kindness, big and small. No thunderous applause had followed their journey. No trophies or awards. But the respect they carried, in their brotherhood, within their community, and in themselves, was the greatest honor of all. And as the sun climbed higher, they embraced the quiet power of having earned it together.